retool myself into a biographer. So that is what, stripped of all the other garnish, I consider myself. I'm a biographer. I'm an old-fashioned feature writer who can't write anything short anymore. So be warned. Part of what I do is study the presidency. There are about 70 of us in the country who have that specialty. And some of them are very highfalutin and specialize in one or two presidents. I like to find out where all the presidents have been, what they've done, and if I can find them stepping foot just once in Vermont, I'm more than passing curious about what they did. And over the years, the combination of writing biography and studying local history, more or less, as Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local, all history is local. History is a mosaic of many pieces that you have to assemble. And for me, the mosaic has created shifting images of what has happened in this state. In many ways, typical, I hate to say, typical of the rest of the country. In other ways, stubbornly independent. But by looking at the presidency and putting it together with a defined area over time, like Vermont, we can see some interesting things happening and changes. Vermont is, and has been from the beginning, more important than it deserves to be politically for the population and the size. So what I've done is I've gone back and I've looked at the different presidents who've come here and what impact that had and what their motivations were. And what historians like to do is come up with a grand synthesis. I just have a little one. My synthesis is this, that you really can't tell why they come after years of studying. You really can't. It's certainly not one clear motive. In fact, it's usually two. And one is usually masquerading as the other, which makes it all the more fun. When they say they're coming here on vacation, don't you believe it. They never are on vacation, wherever they are. There's always somebody they have to see or some group they have to placate, even when they come to go fishing. Depends on whose house they freeload at, exactly what their motivation is. A few of them have been caught by history here, and their lives profoundly changed. I'm thinking especially of Teddy Roosevelt. And so what I'm going to do tonight is not to try to give you a list or an encyclopedia, but try to take you through how these visits have, how important they've been and how they have changed since the first visit of founding fathers at the moment of creation of the state of Vermont. And the first, and this was my original research in presidential history, was studying the life of Thomas Jefferson. I'm still studying the life of Thomas Jefferson. I'm happy to say far more people are now than when I started about 20 years ago. Here he is. He was Secretary of State in 1791, and he's really the man that wrote Vermont into statehood. The Republic of Vermont considered itself on equal terms with the United States when it applied for admission to the Union in 1791. So the governor and his council set papers down to Philadelphia, then the capital, and said, we want to be annexed as an equal partner to the United States. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, said, balderdash. Put them in the round file. They haven't been seen since. And he sat down and wrote the 10 appropriate documents that now repose in the Secretary of State's Office of Vermont. So Jefferson actually wrote Vermont into existence. He was very interested in the place because he wanted Vermont to become the first state to join the Union after the original 13, and he wanted it to be a free state that came in first because Kentucky was ready ahead of Vermont. but Kentucky was coming into the Union as a slave state. And while Jefferson has taken an awful lot of flack over slavery in recent years, to me this is proof of his effort to try to find some solution to the terrible problem of slavery that he and his neighbors couldn't figure a way out of. So Vermont became the 14th state. From its constitution, it had banned slavery, and the man who joined him in this effort was his old nemesis, Alexander Hamilton. Now, Hamilton didn't become president, so I'm not going to put his picture up as a wanted poster on our wall tonight. Hamilton lived across the border in New York at the time, where he was the son-in-law of General Philip Schuyler, no friend to the Green Mountain Boys. But Alexander Hamilton's specialty was Vermont land law. I've since done a biography of Hamilton, and I've actually been able to find him coming here once, and maybe more than that, but I do have him coming to court in Rutland in a land case, and that only appears in a British Traveler's Journal. Vermont historians had not been able to find it, but sometimes they looked a little too narrowly through the blinkers. So Hamilton was very interested in Vermont coming into the Union as a free state as well. He was the founder of the first abolition society in America, and he was anti-slavery. So it may be the only thing that Hamilton and Jefferson never really agreed on, that Vermont should come into the Union, and it should come in free, and it should come in fast. Jefferson was obscure when he first came to Vermont. Nobody knew, outside of a handful of men, that he had written the Declaration of Independence. It was a revolutionary document, and it was still secret until Jefferson decided to use it as a campaign issue when he ran for president in 1800. Much better known was his best friend, his traveling companion when they came to Vermont in May of 1791, James Madison, Jemmy. When I think of the two of them together, 6 foot, 3.5 Jefferson, and 5 foot, 2 or 3 inches James Madison, I can't get the image of Mutt and Jeff out of my head. I just can't, especially since the Jeff part works. But these were the closest of friends. These were the closest of friends. And the two of them had a very deep curiosity about this new place that they had helped to create. Madison was much better known because he was the author of the Bill of Rights that had just come into existence the year before, which made him popular with everybody, those who would oppose the Constitution and those who were in favor of it, because it put into writing the first Bill of Rights that had ever been granted to citizens anywhere in the world. It was that monumental an achievement to spell it all out. Madison at the time was a bachelor. He would remain a bachelor for a few more years. He had not been introduced to this charming lady yet, Dorothea, actually, Dolly Madison. So we'll take her out of the picture. She would have changed the relationship of the 35-day trip that Jefferson and Madison made, coming to Vermont in May and June of 1791. Now, I missed this trip entirely when I wrote about Jefferson in a 5-year-long biography. I missed it. But when a book goes into paperback, you usually have 30 days to make corrections. And being a very anxious type about these things, I went over all my materials once more and found at the end of a roll of microfilm something I hadn't looked at before. I had just assumed that the whole roll of microfilm was land deeds from Virginia land transactions. But the second half of it that I had never looked at was a travel journal. Thomas Jefferson was an obsessive, as well as compulsive, keeper of expense accounts, even though he didn't have one. So wherever he went, I had learned he kept day by day detailed records of everything he spent and everyone he saw. So on the end of a roll of microfilm from the New York Public Library, I found a day-by-day record of Jefferson's trip through New York and up through Vermont and down through Connecticut and Long Island and back to Philadelphia in that spring and summer of 1791. So we've learned a lot about it. It does not say why he did it. He did it for two reasons, or why they did it. First of all, they had to get out of town, the town being Philadelphia, the nation's capital. Jefferson, as Secretary of State in George Washington's cabinet, was supposed to agree with George Washington and with Hamilton, Secretary of Treasury, on everything, especially in public. But a troublemaker named Tom Paine had just published something called The Rights of Man. And Jefferson not only liked it, but he wrote a letter of introduction to a printer, highly recommending that the book be published. He should have known better about printers. The printer, without permission, ran it as the introduction to the book. And George Washington was the last to know. He apologized deeply and talked to his friend Madison and said, "Don't you think it'd be a very nice time to go to Vermont?" So they knew Washington was heading south, and so they headed toward Vermont. The cover story is even flimsier than you might imagine. They said that they were looking at the ravages of the Hessian fly on the wheat crops of the Northeast. And Jefferson was the vice president of a little cranky group called the American Philosophical Society. So he told everybody that's why he was going. Actually, what he and Madison had in mind was exploring the idea of a political party. So what's really going on in this trip, underneath all their cover stories, is that they were turning the anti-federalists, the people who had opposed the Constitution and a central federal government, into what would become the Democratic Republican Party and what we now call the Democratic Party. There are no parties in our Constitution, which might be nice to remember at this insane primary season. Did we have to have that? I myself favor dueling. Single combat. It's over quickly. You don't waste billions. We had it. That's Burr, who was vice president and probably going to run for president the next time, shot Hamilton, who was the head of his party. It was very neat. Hamilton passed over into sainthood, and Burr had to flee the country. That's my idea of how to settle an election sometimes. I'm being facetious. They had no idea what they were getting into. But they had serious disagreements from the beginning of the importance of states, of the importance of commerce, on taxing, etc. And you have this red-headed league of Hamilton, Jefferson, and Washington within a few hundred feet of each other in row houses of Philadelphia, and there are fissures already forming, only 2 years after the first presidency began. So basically, Jefferson and Madison left town in a carriage where they would have privacy and a lot of time to talk. What's fascinating about the travel journal is where they stopped. Their first stop was in New York City, where they met with Aaron Burr. Now, we can't read history backward. He wasn't a bad fellow yet, but he was to be the founder of the Democratic political party in New York City. They already knew that he was a force to reckon with. So there's no record of where they stayed in New York City, which leads me to surmise that they stayed with Burr at Richmond Hill and never wrote any of it down. We have no record of the meeting. They also interviewed the best journalist in America at the time, Philip Freneau, an old classmate or schoolmate of Madison's from Princeton, and they tried to retain him to start an opposition newspaper, which is the first step toward party formation. Freneau hesitated. "I won't dance. Please ask me." And on the way back, he agreed to set up the Gazette of the United States to oppose Hamilton's United States Gazette to further confuse the public. So what's really going on in this trip is party formation, I'm convinced. Along the way, Jefferson could have invented the word multitasking, because wherever he went, he opened more spreadsheets and started more records. We have the first restaurant reviews. Wherever they ate, he either gave them a star, no comment, or a minus. And he passed those recommendations along to his grandchildren, his nephews, his friends, their children. Whenever they traveled up this way, they were warned about certain places and sent to others. He also was a botanist, and he would actually discover 4 specimens that would bear his name on this trip. He also was very enamored of something called the sugar maple. If you are so inclined to read more about how Jefferson brought the maple syrup industry to Vermont and didn't find it here, I recommend that you go to www.slate.com for April 2nd, in other words, Monday. And there's a wonderful column in there on the maple sugar industry and how Jefferson and Madison introduced it on this trip. I didn't write it, but their natural history writer did. So they were coming to Vermont and stopping along the way and talking to people and urging them to start industries that would make them more self-sufficient and less dependent on the British Empire, which still in effect surrounded the infant United States and cut off its trade. So Jefferson, while he was up here, recommended that every Vermonter plant at least 70 maple trees, if they didn't already have them, that should provide enough maple syrup to give them all they needed to stop using sugar that they had to buy with hard money from the British in the slave islands of the Caribbean. So that's part of his agenda. He didn't bring enough paper. Jefferson had a problem. He wrote 28,000 letters. He just couldn't stop writing. So he ran out of paper. 4 of his letters, which are wonderful reports that he wrote back to his daughter at Monticello, were on birch bark. And they now repose in the Morgan Library, and I've had the pleasure of reading them. They're perfect white vellum, and the ink hasn't faded, and they haven't been discolored at all in over 200 years. And he describes the climate, the geology, the flora, the fauna, everything as he goes along on a laptop. Now, the original laptop was wood that tipped up, and it had the ink stand and the pen and all of that. A lot of the time, he was on a boat because they came up the Hudson River on a sloop. Where was the carriage? He turned it over to his slave, James Hemmings, older brother of Sally. I've spent so much time trying to understand slavery, but it still blew my mind that James got the carriage, the horses, the guns, the fishing tackle, the clothing, and was trusted to go alone wherever he wanted, while Madison and Jefferson just lolled along on a sloop on the Hudson, etc. Didn't worry. Part of the key is that Jefferson never had any money. The travel record shows that he was borrowing from his slave. The slave was having to buy the produce. The slave worked for tips. Jefferson was always waiting for the next crop to come in. So Jefferson had to borrow from his slave for food, and for the hotels, he borrowed from Madison. This was a lifelong debtor. So, perfect advocate for a debtor party, which he founded. Well, I can't go into the whole trip, except nothing went right. Madison's horse came up lame. He wrote to Washington that he was having cavalry troubles. They sailed on Lake George and absolutely loved it. Jefferson said it was the most beautiful body of water he had ever seen. They reached Lake Champlain at the beginning of black fly season on Memorial Day, and he moaned in the letter back home to Monticello that he had never seen heat come on so suddenly. The winds were contrary. They tried to come up to Burlington. I'm sure they were trying to come and meet Governor Thomas Chittenden. But after 4 days of trying to sail down the lake, if you're a sailor, or up the lake, if you're looking at a map, they turned back. They stayed 2 nights at Chimney Point, at the tavern at Chimney Point. The diet was a little spare, so they killed 20 chipmunks to make hunter's pie. Jefferson made a note of this species of creature he had never seen before, a small red squirrel with a black stripe, that he said had remarkable stamina. He watched one swim entirely across Lake Champlain, and then they shot it and ate it. We shouldn't sugarcoat these people. It's much better not to. They turned back. They went down to Saratoga. The clock was ticking. They only had 35 days before they had to be back at Congress. They cut across through the scrub highlands on the New York side and crossed along the Willamette Valley into Bennington, where the next set of disasters took place. First of all, Jefferson, as Secretary of State, was in charge of protocol for the United States. And he didn't know there was such a thing as a blue law. They didn't have them where he came from. The idea that you couldn't even travel on the Sabbath. Bennington had blue laws. So they wound up staying over until Monday. They spent most of the time going to dinner, it seems. He taking people to dinner at the Willamette Inn, which is still there in sad repair, but it's still there. That's where they stayed. Until Governor Robinson invited them up to his house near Mount Anthony. Jefferson fell in love with a balsam fir and hugged it and described it and named it. So he would be the first Vermont tree hugger. I think we can grant him that much. The natives said that he had missed the Battle of Bennington, and it was back 7 miles, so as exhausted as they were, they had to ride with the natives back to Bennington and then come back into Bennington again, just in time to go to church, where the Reverend Job Swift indelicately and indirectly lampooned Jefferson and Madison, how surprised he was to see them in church, considering he said it was so rare that they were ever seen in any church. Footnote, when Jefferson was elected president, Job Swift was fired and sent to a mission church in the wilds of Shelburne. But here in Vermont, Jefferson and Madison talked to Anthony Haswell, a journalist, the new governor, the new U.S. senator, other leaders, not only about economic independence, but on the necessity for setting up a strong economy and state government here in Vermont. He also wrote that the British had not left the islands, that they were violating the Treaty of Paris of 1783, that they had built a fort on North Hero, and that they were stopping American ships and searching them. And he predicted that there would be war with England 20 years before there was. So they had a very interesting visit. I don't think either of them had any thought of ever running for president of the United States. But the personal animosity and the economic gulf between Hamilton and Jefferson only widened. Washington only stayed on for a second term, I'm convinced, because he was sure these two young hotheads would ruin the country if he didn't stay on. Washington refused a third term, as far as I can tell, because he just wouldn't take it from the media anymore. He wrote home to friends in Virginia that they treat me as a common thief, a pickpocket, a defaulter of debt. And he wouldn't take it anymore. He was going back to Mount Vernon. And so then we had Adams and Hamilton and a Federalist Party, and Jefferson and Madison organized an opposition party, the Democratic Republicans. Adams never came up here. He didn't have very much time. He's the first president to be unpopular enough not to be reelected. He's the first one-term president. His policies came up here, though, and Anthony Haswell, who was there at dinner with Jefferson and Madison, was arrested under the Alien and Sedition laws and would be held for several months as the Supreme Court justices went around the country in carriages, reading the newspapers and arresting the printers for violating the Alien and Sedition laws. Don't pay attention to the alien part. What's really going on, the Alien and Sedition law said it was illegal to criticize the government. And Jefferson would decide to come out of semi-retirement and organize a political party and run for president because he thought that the First Amendment was real and that government needed to be criticized, and he himself did a lot of that. So these are our first two, I think, activist presidents, Jefferson and Madison. They traveled widely. Jefferson had spent 5 years in France. Jefferson had been to England and seen the Industrial Revolution beginning there. Washington never left the United States. As a young man, he went to Barbados for a month or so with his half-brother. But he never traveled. Jefferson and Adams were much more worldly, much more aware of what was happening in Europe. They turned over their party, first Jefferson to Madison. Jefferson and Madison were extremely unpopular before they were through because of Jefferson's embargo, which cut into the incomes of at least a third of Vermonters who made their livelihood from smuggling. Jefferson activated the militia in Vermont, which led to a gun battle on the Winooski River, in which smugglers used a gun with an amazing 90-inch barrel. I think that was intended to kill an entire flock of ducks at once, but they happened to hit 4 federal officers, killing one of them and seriously wounding 3 others. And the leader of the smugglers was hanged in the first execution in Vermont. And so the Jefferson embargo was a disaster for Vermont's economy and for him personally. He's the only president I've ever seen whose name was taken off a county. What we now call Washington County was first called Jefferson County. So the only trace of him in Vermont is Jeffersonville, which is not the same thing. The next visitor had started out as an intelligence officer in the Continental Army. The next presidential visitor, James Monroe. He had been Washington's eyes and ears in the South during the Revolution. He's best known for something he didn't do, the Monroe Doctrine. That was really done by his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who would be another one-term Adams president who didn't come to Vermont, so that's the last you'll hear of him. But Monroe presided over what was called the era of good feeling after the War of 1812, as America, for the first time, could breathe a sigh of relief. The British were no longer trying to get us back into the empire. They had failed to keep us twice. Now we could get down to business. The Erie Canal was built. The first spur canal was built up here, the Hudson and Champlain Canal. Vermont turns from facing Canada to facing south, to facing New York markets, New York City. So Monroe's presidency is one of prosperity and expansion for people here. And when he came here, he came up the Connecticut Valley, stayed in Windsor, stayed with one of the oldest families, the Evarts families, the Evarts family in Windsor, where 4 presidents would eventually freeload when they came on vacation, the home of Senator Evarts. But Monroe came across the state, and he also stayed at what we now call the Vermont Hotel, the old Vermont Hotel in Burlington. One of the wonderful things about these talks for me is that I learn maybe more than you do, because there's always somebody in the audience who has heard of something that I haven't heard of yet. So when I first gave this talk, I did not know that 4 presidents, at least, had been entertained at the old American House, as it was then called, now the Vermont Hotel, across from City Hall Park in Burlington. So Monroe is the first president to visit there, although Lafayette had been there before him, and other luminaries would after him. But Monroe came visiting and politicking in Vermont, and established a precedent, basically, of visiting one side of the state and then crossing over to the other. I think they were aware already that the state was divided, and that you just couldn't assume you had the political support of one side if you had the other. In fact, quite the contrary. So Monroe is the next visitor. We won't spend a whole lot of time on him. I think he was just saving the saved. His party was unopposed. The Jeffersonian Party actually only was out of power once between 1800 and 1860 when the Civil War came along. Only once, when a party, the Whig Party, which came and went very quickly, elected a war hero who died within a month and left, William Henry Harrison left the country in a bad way. But the Democrats of Jefferson were the majority party for 60 years. So Monroe didn't have to campaign. He came here on a junket, but also to see what was going on here. Fact-finding was part of what presidents were doing from a very early time. Hamilton had set the tradition of fact-finding by charging customs officials with filing weekly reports. Our first statistics are based on customs figures from the time of Hamilton on. Weekly reports gave the federal government market information, population information, etc. So Monroe already had a pretty good snapshot of what was going on here. Vermont was in a very bad way at the time Monroe came, because Vermonters had clear-cut their hardwoods to make houses and barns that Madison admired, because he had only seen brick and hadn't seen beautiful Vermont wooden houses. But Vermonters had taken most of the wood and either cut it up and sailed it as rafts up to Canada, rafts big enough to have log cabins on for the crews, where they were then dismantled and sold as lumber, and anything that couldn't be cut into a straight board was chopped up and put into a large iron kettle and turned into potash, which was terrifically valuable for the British chemical industry and the making of textiles. So Vermonters were exporting their forest as fast as they could between 1791 and 1816. When it rained and snowed all summer, it's called the year without winter. But after 2 years of no sunlight, because of a volcanic eruption in Mexico, no sunlight, no photosynthesis, no crops, and heavy rains, the topsoil washed off into the creeks and into Lake Champlain. Art Cohn of the Maritime Museum found a ship at the mouth of Otter Creek. The topmast was under 8 feet of silt, and he can say that that is exactly what happened at that time. There were no roots left to hold the soil. And Vermont switched from the highest per acre wheat yield in the United States in 1790 to a grazing state. All that you could do was raise sheep and not a crop very quickly. And Vermonters were leaving and not coming by the time James Monroe came, leaving, following the Erie Canal, taking jobs in new cities along the Erie Canal, or heading out west to start over. So Vermont was sort of between rocks in a hard place in the 1820s until the introduction of merino sheep around 1830 directly from Spain resuscitated the economy, especially Addison County, until there were 1.5 million sheep, merino sheep grazing in Vermont by 1840. And it was hard to find the people for all the sheep. That also brought woolen mills and the Industrial Revolution to Vermont. So Vermont changed rapidly, but by the time Monroe came in the 1820s, things were not going so well. We have to drop down to Martin Van Buren. Now, here's a president you couldn't pick out of a lineup. I didn't know what he looked like, I have to confess. When I started reading up about the presidents, I had to double check. Martin Van Buren. Well, he came to Vermont because he had to. He had to because there was strong political opposition coming here. Henry Clay was campaigning here. Now, we can't put him up here with the presidents, but Henry Clay, I think, was the most popular American in the first half of the 19th century. It isn't that he had movie actor good looks or anything. He was a spellbinding orator. He was also a warmonger. He's the man that really stirred up the War of 1812 with his war hawk faction within the Democratic Party. But he would become known in history as the Great Compromiser. So it depends on from what point of view you're looking at the man. I don't think he's that handsome, but apparently the ladies did. Because after the second war that he helped stir up, the Mexican War, in which his only son was killed, he went to Cape May, New Jersey to try to go into solitude and be left alone and nurse his wounds. And men, but mostly women, crowded onto steamboats from New York City and New Haven and crowded into wagons and coaches from Philadelphia and mobbed him in the surf at Cape May with their little scissors snipping off most of his hair to make lockets. So he not only lost his son in the Mexican War, but his hair. But when he came here, he was coming from Canada. He was a very effective spokesman for the United States, building up trade with Canada. And he actually was talked into coming to Vermont. He didn't intend to. But he was so popular that he came to Vermont, and thousands of people gathered at Burlington to welcome him, and wherever he stopped along the way. By this time, people are going up and down the lake by steamboat. The second steamboat built in the world is the Vermont, built only a year after Robert Fulton built the Claremont. It was also the first steamboat in the world to sink. I don't know exactly where. I think Art Cohn is on the job. So Henry Clay came, and as a result of that, Martin Van Buren came. He didn't intend to. But I have to explain that presidents did not travel to campaign, nor did candidates. That didn't start until 1896. And the first presidential candidate to do a whistle-stop tour was a man who worked for the railroads and then organized the biggest strike against them, Eugene V. Debs. Debs, the founder of the Socialist Party, ran 6 times, but he ran on tracks. From the back of railroad car platforms, he introduced that kind of fist-waving oratory that characterized presidential campaigns right down, I think, until Harry Truman in 1948, when he used it very effectively. So for half a century, you had the railroad as the principal mode of transportation, not only for presidential candidates, but for presidents themselves. So after Monroe's visit, the next politician that will come, Millard Fillmore, will be coming on a steamboat. Now here's another one you couldn't pick out very quickly. You'd have to quickly go back and check, who is that man? Millard Fillmore, very, very handsome fellow. I gave myself a quiz to try to figure out what president he was. He's number 13, which may account for his luck of becoming the first president to become president because he succeeded a president. No, that's not true. The second who died in office. Polk succeeded John Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison. But Fillmore passed out of obscurity and back into it between 1850 and 1853. But he had enough time to squeeze out a visit to Vermont. So here is Millard Fillmore. I think there's a museum to him in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Maybe that's the only one. But again, totally obscure. The country didn't want him. They wanted Zachary Taylor, the war hero. But Zachary Taylor didn't last very long in the White House. They opened his tomb a few years ago. A woman wrote a novel and said he'd been poisoned. Now, Americans are always ready for a conspiracy theory, especially if it involves a president. So a novelist wrote a potboiler about Zachary Taylor, and so out in Louisville, they opened up his sarcophagus and tested his DNA and everything else they could find. They kept him out for a while and shipped him over to the dental school so they could photograph his teeth, before they put him back in again. I mean, I love this. Now there are people who want to dig up every president and check their DNA. So Taylor succumbed from cherries and clotted cream on a hot day, I think on the 4th of July festivity. He was grossly overweight. He'd had to have help for years getting on and off his horse, even though he was the great war hero. But he overdid it on cold clotted cream and cherries and died. So we have Millard Fillmore, the handsome, chiseled, featured, undistinguished, and forgettable president, who was not reelected, joining that club. The next Vermont visitor actually was a good neighbor, Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire. There's a college named after him. I've spoken there. It's a beautiful place. But he liked to come over and have picnics with the Green Mountain Boys in the woods on the Vermont side of things when he was running against Daniel Webster, who also liked to come over from Hanover and have picnics with the Green Mountain Boys. You get the picture. There was a lot of picnicking going on. But Vermont was not yet dry. That would happen a few years later. But campaigning became an art of currying the favor of veterans very early along. So whenever a president someone wanted to be president, they had to identify the veterans groups and make a beeline from state to state to state to all the veterans. And we see this expanding after the Civil War, especially when Vermont per capita had twice as many veterans as any other state. The South didn't have many because so many were killed. But Vermonters, who were not neighbors of Southerners and didn't have any slavery, apparently liked to shoot so much that twice as many Vermonters enlisted in the Union Army per capita as any other state, leaving the Grand Army of the Republic a very powerful veterans group, and one of the reasons why from the Civil War on, presidents had to come here to get the veterans vote. So we have Franklin Pierce coming to visit. We don't know an awful lot more about that visit. I'm running behind on my pictures. Here's Henry Clay. Now, I guess this is after they cut off his hair. He doesn't seem to like the camera very much either. I wasn't sure that he was here or some of the others were here until one of my audience told me about the Vermont Hotel. Now you can't see it, but down behind that tree, at the corner of St. Paul Street and Main in Burlington is this plaque. Site of the American House, 1808 to 1893. Presidents Monroe, Van Buren, Pierce, and Grant. General Scott, Winfield Scott, Wool, Hampton, Henry Clay, and other famous people entertained here. The list is much longer than that, and they've missed a few presidents, as it turns out. But this is the kind of physical evidence that historians just love to stumble upon, because it's a clue. Then you can go on and look at the records and the newspapers, and you can find a lot more. So Franklin Pierce, our neighbor, came over from Hanover and traveled all the way to Burlington as well, because Burlington was already the largest population center, the Queen City of the North. Pierce's presidency would be sort of a holdover, a stopgap, because by now the country was really embroiled in the issue of slavery. Any president elected in the 1850s, I think, would have been doomed to failure. What historians now call the inevitable conflict. There seemed to be no resolution short of a civil war. So Pierce, except in New Hampshire, fades very quickly into obscurity. Our next presidential visitor, well, I'm trying to prove that he is, and I think I've got it. It's taken years. There's no record of him coming to Vermont. His wife came. His kids came. He was supposed to come to the equinox on vacation in the summer of 1865, because his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and his son, Robert, liked their vacation there in the summer of 1864. You can go in the lobby, and there's the hotel register signed on the wall. And they liked Vermont so much that they were going to bring the old man back, except he was shot. He never got to come back. I have a witness who said he waved to her great-grandmother as he went by on a train, and this woman has the deed that shows the property along the railroad, and this is uncorroborated evidence, but people who took trains didn't leave records. But Lincoln went back and forth from Springfield, Illinois, to visit his son at Exeter, and then to visit his son at Harvard, and to do a little campaigning along the way for any Whig candidate. So for me, the quest is documenting that Abraham Lincoln came here. But so far, I have him going by and waving out a train window. He was virtually here because he took on a Vermonter, Stephen Douglas. Looks awfully tough for 5'3". But just move the camera a little closer. Lincoln took him apart in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. But Stephen Douglas was the leader of the Democratic Party. And Stephen Douglas came to Vermont and stayed in Burlington on July 29th, 1860. He arrived at the home of the head of the Democratic National Committee, Judge Smalley, U.S. District Court Judge for Vermont. And so Douglas came to David Smalley's house, present Smalley Park in Burlington, 42 Adams Street, and he stayed long enough to go and give a commencement address for the University of Vermont. And that was another lure for presidents to visit. They timed their visits for graduations, when they could not only pick up votes, but honorary degrees, several of them, not only at UVM, but at Middlebury and at St. Michael's College. It seems to be how you take a little bit of the rough edge off of raw politics as you come and you give a commencement address and you get a degree. So Gerald Ford, when he was House minority leader, would get an honorary degree at St. Michael's and build some fences that would come in handy later on. So we have Douglas of Lincoln and Douglas's debate. Douglas would carry Vermont. He was the last Democrat to carry Vermont before John Kennedy, exactly 100 years later, tried to carry it but lost to Nixon. LBJ, actually, is the first Democrat after the Civil War to carry Vermont in a presidential election. But they all kept trying. This is what Lincoln looked like at the time. Most of the pictures today, he's got a beard because an 8-year-old girl wrote a letter saying, "Sir, you really ought to grow a beard. You really would look better with the beard." Lincoln was not self-conscious about his looks. During the Lincoln-Douglas debates, a heckler yelled at him, "How do you expect to be President of the United States as ugly as you are?" And Lincoln, in the same accent, because they were from the same neck of the woods, said back, "If every ugly man in the United States votes for me, I cannot lose." Kind of repartee that explains his success, his popularity. He married the daughter of a slave owner. His brother-in-laws were Confederate generals. It was a very uncomfortable presidency. She also spent money, and he was as tight as anybody I've ever heard of. You hear of his thrift and his honesty, but she overspent his budget by 100% as First Lady. Here she is in her inaugural gown. This is the hairpiece, but the gown was full of satin roses and spread across the floor as she danced with her husband. After the assassination, you see how profoundly she had changed. It's a very sad story. But she loved to come here. She had to get away from the White House, where there were all the accusations. She actually spent the Civil War on a different floor of the White House from her husband, except at night, with what was supposedly a salon of Confederates, while he galloped off with a guard of cavalry, sabers drawn at the gallop to the soldiers' home, where he spent most of the war in the basement at a telegraph machine, the first president taking the role of commander-in-chief in wartime seriously. Lincoln ran the Civil War and hired and fired generals by telegraph. And Mary Todd Lincoln spent most of the time back in the White House redecorating, establishing another expensive presidential tradition. They kept their son out of the war for as long as possible. That became a campaign issue in 1864. Cartoons showed Robert Todd Lincoln as a little boy hiding behind his mother while Lincoln was off with the generals. And so toward the end of the war, after Robert had graduated from Harvard and also run up some very impressive debts, one of the reasons Lincoln came through on the train was to write checks at Exeter, another presidential tradition. But Robert joined the staff of U.S. Grant at the last minute and had a much nicer uniform on than U.S. Grant at Appomattox when Robert E. Lee, also beautifully dressed, surrendered. So Robert was on the staff, and he was with Abraham Lincoln when Lincoln walked through the streets of Richmond, where only slaves, now freed slaves, remained, and where the whole city had been burned by Lee as he retreated. And Robert stayed with Grant as they slowly made their way back to the city, and as Lincoln went to the Ford Theater with Mary Todd Lincoln on the fatal night of April 15th, 1865. So Robert would have been there if he hadn't taken his new uniform very seriously. Robert would come back to Vermont again and again, as we must all know, because as chief legal counsel for the Pullman Railroad Company, he made quite a fortune. He made a lot of enemies in Chicago, and especially in the town of Pullman in the long strike. But because he loved golf in Vermont, he built a mansion named Hildene, where he would entertain presidents in his turn. But here he is as a Harvard boy. Look at the change one generation can make in America. This man had 5 cowlicks, Abraham Lincoln, and that's an even more diminished Stephen Douglas. Excuse me. So the Civil War is over, and many of the Vermonters have come back, veterans, wounded, missing an arm or a leg, twice as many casualties per capita as any other state in the Union, as well as twice as many volunteering to fight. Vermonters always gave twice as much as they were asked in money and in troops for the Civil War. The great general of the Civil War was the next president to come here, Ulysses Grant, as you will remember from that plaque, staying at the American House in Burlington. My own theory is that Ulysses Grant went as far as he could to get away from his wife. Now, I've documented this. I wrote about Cape May as the first American resort when most of the city was declared a national landmark. I was assigned by Smithsonian to do the history of the town. And when Grant came to New Jersey, he would get a buckboard and a lot of cigars and a flask and ride all day alone. That was his idea of what a president had the right to do. Away from politicians, away from office seekers, away from grafters and grifters and corrupt stock jobbers, but most of all away from Mrs. U.S. Grant. So I don't see her showing up anywhere in his presidential travels, especially to Vermont. But he came and was the hero with the veterans. And as soon as the Civil War was over, the veterans formed the Grand Army of the Republic. And if you go to graveyards around Vermont, the Civil War graves are instantly recognizable. There's a small star on the top of each one with a little bracket for the American flag. And those flags should be replaced every memorial. If you go to graveyards in places like Williston, you'll see 5 brothers, all 5 from one family. The classics professor at UVM, his younger brother, the town doctor, and 3 others went in to sort of even the score, all dead, all lined up next to each other. So Vermont took a terrible toll. The first person condemned to death was a Vermonter from Jeffersonville, and the first presidential pardon of Abraham Lincoln was for this poor 18-year-old who was milking cows a month before he fell asleep on guard duty in Virginia. So I've spent a lot of time working on the Civil War through the eyes of one town, Williston, and what happened to it and how it was transformed. Grant was the first of many presidents who came through for the big parades to rally the veterans. He was followed by other soldiers. And it's good to remember, I think, that most of the presidents in the half century after the Civil War were veterans of the Civil War. And we don't know much about them anymore. Rutherford B. Hayes. His name only comes up if you want to say rigged election in Florida. The first rigged election in Florida, excuse me. James A. Garfield, a general, a Methodist minister, who was a college president until the Civil War came along. He lasted 1 month until he was shot to death by a disgruntled office seeker, which left the fourth vice president to succeed to the presidency, our own Chester Arthur. Now, I'd get a lot of grief in Fairfield, Vermont, if I said it. But Chester Arthur, we can't prove he was born here. We can assert it. We can fund it. We can build a museum. We can do all we want. But his father was a sort of a layabout itinerant preacher from Quebec province, and Chester Arthur may have been born on the other side of the border, whatever you thought I was going to say. So they claim him too. We should give him honorary dual citizenship because Fairfield is building quite a nice historic site. For a boy whose father couldn't hold a job, he came out pretty well. That's a fur Persian lamb. Beautiful coat. Chester Arthur. We don't know an awful lot about him at first. His father was headmaster of Williston Academy for 1 year and preacher at the Central Church there until he quarreled with the vestry or the trustees or whatever they were called. And then he moved to Heinsberg, and he was head of the church and ran a little school there for a year, 1833. Not even a whole year before the family moved to New York State. And we lose them for a while, but it was in New York State that Chester Arthur found his political fortune. He wound up one of the wealthiest politicians in America because he was made collector of the port of New York City. Whoever was collector of the port of New York City really collected. Look at that coat. Some of the people who worked for him didn't do quite so well. So the fellow who wrote Moby Dick and couldn't make a living as a writer worked for Chester Arthur, going on and off ships and documenting the fraud in their holds. So fame is very funny. But Chester Arthur became a president when Garfield was shot. The presidency, like the Supreme Court, seemed to change people, often for the better. So he turned into a model president in 2 ways. He's the man who pushed through civil service reform so that you couldn't have disgruntled office holders shooting presidents anymore. They would have to find some other reason. But the civil service tests, which were weighted to favor veterans and the disabled long before anything else did, were the invention of Chester Arthur, and they completely destroyed the political power of his own party, because he'd been backed by one of the more corrupt politicians in the United States, even beyond him. A man who has a town across the lake named after him. William Platt of Plattsburgh. Senator Platt, the head of the Republican machine of New York for several years. So Chester Arthur broke with him and put through the patronage, ended the patronage system. I love the cartoons of that period. Shelves for disobedient men. He would eventually try to shelve Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt wanted to be mayor of New York. His own party sold him out. He then wanted to be president. They put him in the most obscure job they could think of. This man nominated him for vice president. But this is Platt, of Plattsburgh. And he's the reason Teddy Roosevelt got into politics, to get rid of him. The next man that Platt backed was the extremely popular William McKinley, who had a great fondness for Vermont. He visited here at least 3 times. Was often the house guest of Senator Redfield Proctor, who was the man in charge of the marble industry in Vermont. Some people say he had a lot to do with the Spanish-American War. He did go on a fact-finding mission, give a fire and brimstone speech in the Senate that led almost immediately to a declaration of war against Spain when an American ship, the Maine, blew up. It's only in the last few years that proof has emerged that the Maine blew up because it had a defective boiler and it wasn't blown up by the Spanish at all, but it gave us a pretext to take the old Spanish Empire apart and adopt it for ourselves. So McKinley, here he is campaigning for president on a wicker rocker because it's still front porch campaign time. He's the last president who didn't do a whistle-stop tour on a train. He stayed on the porch in Canton, Ohio, and his supporters came to him. And so in Vermont, the leading members of the Republican Party rented Locomotive 101 of the Rutland Railroad and put together a long train, posh train, decked with red, white, and blue bunting, and went all the way to Canton, Ohio to support William McKinley and to bring cash and food. You didn't go there to feed, you brought the food with you. So this is McKinley, supported by business interests in Ohio. But he came here several times, several years in a row. And he came up here at the same time Teddy Roosevelt did in 1901, right after McKinley won re-election to a second term. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was much more popular than William McKinley. Here's the official portrait where he's off his rocker. Here's Teddy Roosevelt and what he was doing to McKinley and to the Republican Party. He's Teddy Roosevelt, vice president, but he's the hero of San Juan Hill. He is my favorite president. He really is. When I was a kid, I bought a lot of dusty old books from a used bookstore and actually read them. And I read his book called The Strenuous Life, which was a bestseller. And he preached the strenuous life wherever he went, thousands of speeches. But the one line in it, one line I've just clung to my whole life, is do the best you can with what you have, where you are. I can't think of a better motto. And that was his. He did pretty well. He was born with severe asthma. His father we would call a draft dodger, because his father hired a substitute to fight for him, who was legitimate in the Civil War, setting up the need for the son psychologically to risk his life in war. But Teddy Roosevelt was nearly blind. His eyesight was so bad. He got in a lot of trouble with kids because he wore glasses when that was considered a feat. His father dosed him for his asthma at night with a cigar, the age of 5, smoking cigars, and drinking a glass of milk laced with creosote. So it didn't kill him. I think it made him tougher. He had a lot of misfortune. He married his sweetheart at Harvard, where he was a championship wrestler, by the way. He married his sweetheart, and when their Their first child, their only child, was 4 months old. His wife and his mother died on the same day. So a devastated Teddy Roosevelt went west. And, well, he was a cowboy of sorts. Here he is. As a cowboy, he was a little unusual. He insisted on being called Mr. Roosevelt by the other cowhands. Here he is in the attire. He came back and wrote about his experiences on a dude ranch. This is his book jacket photo. You will notice that his buckskins are pretty nice. They're from Abercrombie and Fitch. And his sheath knife is from Tiffany's. So the New York aristocrat goes west. When the Spanish-American War came, though, he volunteered and he put together the first integrated cavalry unit in the United States Army, the Rough Riders. There had been 2 regiments of black troops since the end of the Civil War. They had always had white officers. And he had been out west, and he had seen that many of the cowboys were African Americans who had gone west after leaving the Union Army at the end of the Civil War. So he put together his own, the Rough Riders, who distinguished themselves in Cuba in the Spanish-American War. He was still very nearsighted, and he became a hero by mistake. He charged up San Juan Hill and went over the top under terrific fire before he noticed his men were still at the bottom. That's how heroes are made if they survive. It also explains wonderful scenes in Arsenic and Old Lace, if you've seen the movie. But here he is with his integrated outfit, the Rough Riders. So he came back a war hero. He became police commissioner of New York. He had tried to run for mayor and had been undercut by Platt. Platt tried to get rid of him politically by backing him for vice president to McKinley in McKinley's second term. Here he is when he's the new vice president in 1901. And in the summer of 1901, after the elections, McKinley headed north and stayed at the Champlain Hotel, overlooking Valcour Island, overlooking Lake Champlain, overlooking Vermont, while Teddy Roosevelt came in from the other side on a train, a whistle-stop tour, entering the state at Brattleboro and going town by town, turning out enormous crowds wherever he went. His host was, again, Redfield Proctor, a close friend of McKinley. But Teddy Roosevelt stopped in Rutland. He stopped in Windsor. He stopped in Chester. In Rutland, 7,500 people turned out, several times the population of Rutland. People literally came down from the hills. Going through here quickly to find a picture of him. He was practically mobbed in Middlebury when the train stopped here. Dignitaries were invited to come onto the train and meet him and shake his hand, and then he went out and gave the usual speeches. I have a picture of him when he came the second time. He came to Vermont, went town by town, headed for Shelburne Farms, the home of Colonel Webb, who had a steam yacht, who transported Teddy Roosevelt and many of the leading. Vermont is strewn with ex-governors at the time because of its the short term of office. So every ex-governor manages to get onto the steam yacht of Colonel Webb as they sail up to Grand Isle in September of 1901. They're headed for the home of the lieutenant governor. The Elfrida, Webb's yacht, docks at Isle La Motte, and at the home of Lieutenant Governor Nelson Fisk. There's an enormous tent for the annual Fish and Game dinner. The tent is big enough, and there's enough fish and game left in Vermont to feed 5,000 people at a sumptuous lunch. Teddy Roosevelt has his share and goes in for a nap on Lieutenant Governor Fisk's in his guest room. Here's part of the crowd under this enormous tent. It's a blurred picture from a 1901 Vermont magazine, but you could get the scale of it. It's a big feed. So Teddy Roosevelt goes in for a siesta, I think a habit he picked up in Cuba, and he's asleep when the phone rings. There are very few phones in Vermont in 1901, but a call had been put through by the postmaster of St. Albans to Lieutenant Governor Fisk that President McKinley had been shot. President McKinley, who had just arrived, having left the Champlain Hotel, crossed by railroad to Buffalo for the opening of Buffalo's World's Fair, which you haven't heard much of since then. He went into the Academy of Music to open the fair, and there a socialist that the socialists have ever since disclaimed walked up to him and shot him twice in the stomach at point-blank range. One bullet bounced off a button, so McKinley rallied for a while, but not before the telephone call came to Nelson Fisk's house that the president had been shot. Teddy Roosevelt got back on the yacht, which took him very quickly to Burlington, where he got in locomotive number 1 of the Rutland Railroad, which took him across to New York, and he went by rail quickly to Buffalo. And by the time he got there, it seemed that McKinley was recovering. Only McKinley had the ill fortune to have the same doctor show up who had shown up at Garfield's assassination, a man who hadn't heard of antisepsis yet and liked to probe open wounds with his finger or with unsterilized instruments. So after a partial recovery, McKinley developed a secondary infection and very quickly was gone. Teddy Roosevelt had hurried back to join his family, which had gone independently to Mount Marcy in the Adirondacks. This is his second wife and their 5 children. She had taken the children to Mount Marcy. So there Teddy Roosevelt was when the second phone call came that McKinley had died. So he raced back to Buffalo. Here he is at Isle La Motte briefing the press after the first phone call, talking to the reporters who traveled with him. You already had the tradition of a large press corps. Behind the yacht, the Elfrida, was a second vessel with about 600 reporters on it. And they were still using pen and paper at the time. I keep disappearing. So Teddy Roosevelt became president, and he loved Vermont. The next year, 1902, he came back. He made 28 stops in 2 days. 1/3 of the population of Vermont came out to hear those speeches on 2 weekdays. 28 speeches. We don't know if there was the same speech over and over again. I've seen a text of his stock speech that he gave here. And it was the bully pulpit. It was lead the strenuous life. Do the best you can with what you have here in Vermont. He came into the state in a tally-ho, driven by best-selling novelist Winston Churchill, not to be confused with the Englishman, coming across from New Hampshire with, here we have, in case you can't see it, Teddy Roosevelt, typical pose wherever he went, Winston Churchill at the reins, Redfield Proctor riding up in the boot. They came across to Windsor, made the obligatory stop at the home of the late Senator William Evarts. 3 other presidents had been there before him. Monroe, Rutherford B. Hayes, and Chester Arthur. But this was called the White House in Vermont. So many presidents freeloaded there for a while. And it was in Bunting, and there was a huge dinner, and that was his first stop. For the rest of his 1902 trip, Teddy Roosevelt climbed back on that famous flagship locomotive of the Rutland Railroad, number 101, and toured the state. Here are the crowds. Rutland. course, if you're in Rutland, you time it right, you have to go to the state fair. And Teddy never missed a state fair. He rode over in a stagecoach to the state fair. There's no hint of security as he does these things. Here we are in Middlebury, the 1902 visit of Teddy Roosevelt. Look at that crowd. And here he is, bully pulpit from the back of the train. Here's a close-up. This is at Montpelier with a smiling deer on the pendant underneath him. The deer apparently isn't worried about being shot by the bull moose, but the crowds love it. Then from Middlebury, Teddy went by the Elfrida again to Burlington to be the guest of Le Grand Canon. What a wonderful name. It's, Thackeray would make up a name like that. Le Grand Canon had built the railroad, owned the steamships on the lake, had built an estate in the Hill District of Burlington, built a great house there. The last of his heirs just died and left or sold one of their mansions to Champlain College, and we're in the permitting process. What more can I say? In Vermont, it could be a while. But Roosevelt spent the night at the home of Le Grand Canon on Overlake. It was called Overlake Drive in Burlington. Then he went down the hill and he stayed at the home of former Governor Woodbury, who had lost an arm in the Civil War, which was a political credential long before Bob Dole. Here's the Elfrida again, which transported Teddy Roosevelt during his visits. Here he is, meeting the dignitaries on the dock in Burlington. Here's Governor Woodbury's mansion on College Street, where Roosevelt stayed his second night in Burlington. Notice the trees. Remember the trees. Elms. All of Burlington, like so many towns in Vermont, was completely shaded by these trees at this time, before Dutch elm disease. Then back on the Elfrida and down to Steamboat Landing at Thompson's Point, farther down the lake near Split Rock. The reason? Because Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury, Leslie Shaw, had a beautiful house there, and it's still in the Shaw family. Those are wonderful wooden houses along there. Burlington hadn't changed much since this map was made in 1877. I like to use it because it shows so many things that are gone, but the Hill District up around Overlake was woods and farms where Le Grand Canon had brought Italian immigrants from northern Italy and Italian immigrants from southern Italy, not only to work and build the railroad and run the steamships, but to grow the food, the fruit and the vegetables that were served on the steamboats and in the dining cars of the railroads. So that is, the Hill District was why there was such a thriving Italian-American community in Burlington, a little Italy, until the 1960s, when urban removal, as I like to think of it, bulldozed Little Italy to make room for Burlington Mall eventually. But here's UVM, and here's the Hill. This is the Burlington Country Club, but all of this, the Country Club wasn't bought until 1926, but all of this was the estate of Le Grand Canon. There was a huge ravine that ran across Burlington at this point. Eventually, the Fletcher Library started to slide into it, so they had to build a modern wing to hold it up. But this is the route from Le Grand Canon's down through Burlington, down to near the waterfront. Here's Battery Street, This was all shipping. The second row trees were being used to make spools and crates and all sorts of things for the textile industry. This was still the Queen City of the Lake. So this is why presidents kept coming there. After Burlington, Teddy Roosevelt went to Montpelier. Here he is in his carriage, being escorted by the cavalry from 40th and Allen, riding their Morgan horses. That contingent would have ridden all the way up to Montpelier, as it did just about everywhere. But this is the cavalry escort, and here's TR tipping his hat to the crowd. A closer view of the cavalry in formation. And then we can find them again if we look, because now there is security. After the assassination of Lincoln, presidents are now protected. But here's the cavalry escort screen, and there were over 500 police, ununiformed police and soldiers mixing in the crowd, as well as the screen of cavalrymen, while the president gave his speech from the Pavilion Building in Montpelier. As president, he was a great reformer. The FDA, the national parks, but he was considered a bit of a crackpot by some people because he wanted to change everything. In one presidency, he thought there should be a universal language with simplified spelling. It should be something like English. So working with the money of Andrew Carnegie, who also liked the idea, they tried to get through Congress a simplified form of English that would be easier to teach immigrants coming to this country. And see, here they are, satirizing him. This is my busy day, the revised dictionary. Teddy Roosevelt was followed by actually a much more effective reformer, William Howard Taft, who, unfortunately for his legend, broke the record for the heaviest president. It wouldn't be known for 50 years that President Taft had gotten stuck in his bathtub in the White House. And there is proof that it was quietly replaced. Here are the three plumbers sitting in it with room to spare after they got him out. And there's a close-up of this enormous tub that was in the White House till Truman renovated the White House again. Well, that's not the view from Vermont. William Howard Taft came here, extremely popular, in 1909 for the 300th anniversary of the arrival of Samuel de Champlain on Lake Champlain, which he modestly named after himself. So here is William Howard Taft getting off, you guessed it, the Elfrida at the waterfront. Now there are people covered with medals from the Spanish-American War. Here's Taft. Here's the entertainment. All these would-be Indians in their canoes blowing out onto the lake. Here's what a town in Vermont looked like in 1909. This is Church Street in Burlington, decked out for its for the tercentenary. Here's the church at the head of Church Street. There was still railroad tracks down the center of the town for quite a long time. Taft went to speak in front of the American House, where he also stayed. Here we are. This great man, a great Chief Justice who passed more reform legislation by far than Teddy Roosevelt did, but he just didn't fit the image. There was just more of him than most people could comprehend. After Burlington, he went and stayed with a Lincoln. Here he is on one of his several visits to Hildene in Manchester with Robert Todd Lincoln, the proprietor of Hildene. Taft would come back again in 1912 because the Republican Party split, and this man came out of mothballs, Teddy Roosevelt, and made another run for the presidency. The Progressive Party, it was called. Everybody else called it the Bull Moose Party, because on his way to their national convention in Chicago, he was shot and went with bloody clothing and went to the convention and said it takes more than a bullet to stop a bull moose. So he became known as the Bull Moose. Thank you. He loved it. He came back to Vermont. And here he is at Montpelier again with, of course, a bull moose. No smiling deer this time for him. Teddy Roosevelt remained terribly popular, assuring that the Democrats would win by splitting the majority party of the Republicans. Which brings us to our next Vermont visitor, who happened to be born here. The only president we can really be sure was born here, Calvin Coolidge. Now this portrait, with no label under it, is in the chapel at Amherst College, because this is Amherst's only president, and they're very, very proud of him. But there he is in the front of the chapel where he had been an undergraduate. He became very well known in Burlington because he met this young lady in Northampton, Massachusetts. She was there studying how to teach the deaf. She was a follower of Helen Keller until she came up with another technique that she helped develop called sign language. And for the rest of her life, Grace Goodhue Coolidge was the principal advocate of the handicapped in the United States. She's also the first college-educated First Lady, Grace Coolidge. She grew up in this house, which is now our marketing and communications department, all chopped into little offices, except a living room where they were married. The marriage license reposes in Burlington City Hall. Married October 4th, 1905. He was already a lawyer in Northampton, the most successful president in American history in terms of elections. He was never defeated, and he was elected 19 times to public offices. I think she wrote the story in the Free Press about their wedding. It was at the house of the Goodhues. Her mother never approved of him. The first time she brought Calvin home, he sat in a corner for 3 hours and didn't say a word. Her mother never got over it. I think the silent Cal started that day. When he became president, she changed only slightly, saying he never would have made it without her. But here's the happy couple. Back rack photograph. When he's governor of Massachusetts, he was elected governor. They moved back to Northampton. He never had a nickel until he was president, and that's not a slur at all. He's the only successful American politician that I know of who was still getting an allowance from his father when he was vice president of the United States. He was so unsuccessful as a lawyer. And he went back in the summers and helped with the harvest and the farm with his father, John, who only passed away a few years ago. The farm's still there. They're still making that wonderful cheese. It's the most amazing presidential birthplace I've ever seen. The man was literally born in a log cabin on the back of his father's general store, across from the cheese factory. It's a 1.5-story log cabin. It's really a little more than one room. And I like to take my students there to say, this is what can happen in this country. This is still what can happen in this country. Well, this is the Coolidge house. As president, they put in indoor plumbing. There's the Pierce Arrow, the best car of the time. His pride and joy parked out front. He found out he was president when his predecessor, Warren Gamaliel Harding, died mysteriously in California just as the worst presidential scandal to that time, the Teapot Dome scandal, was about to break. The Hardings had taken off for a whistle-stop tour all the way to Alaska. They came back to San Francisco, and the first press story said he had had food poisoning. The next day he was dead, and they changed the story and the death certificate to heart disease. There was never an autopsy. There was not an open coffin funeral, and he did not lie in state. Some historians think Florence, his wife, found out about his two mistresses. The one he had as senator, and her best friend and next-door neighbor. So some things we don't know, but we can suspect. So the country was ready for Calvin Coolidge. Good, clean, wholesome, hard-working, likable, silent Cal. He was also the first media president. He was very self-aware of cameras, and he knew how to manipulate the press. So there are pictures. Here he is back at the farm. That smock is a milking smock that had been his grandfather's. It's absolutely clean. The bucket is shiny and empty. The shoes are polished. The cow's udder is deflated. And the press is nearby with the camera. He liked to autograph maple syrup buckets and give them to friends. The friends: Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, Harvey Firestone, his close friends and advisors at Plymouth Notch. Back in Washington, they settled in as President and First Lady, here in a beaver top hat. But Calvin would keep his ties here. He was a trustee of the University of Vermont most of his life. Here they are. They loved dogs. They had a white collie, a black collie, a chow. She was always surrounded with dogs. She kept a pet raccoon as vice president, wife at the Willard Hotel. She wrote about it. At the farm, well, they didn't exactly pitch in with the tours. Here's another press photo. Here's Calvin Coolidge plowing a field that's already been plowed. But he was a shoo-in for re-election. He paid a terrible price, though. They stayed in Washington only one summer. His son played tennis on the lawn without socks, developed a blister. It turned to blood poisoning, and he was dead in 2 weeks. And that's when Calvin Coolidge became Silent Cal. He really wasn't interested anymore. We skip over Herbert Hoover. I have no proof that he came here, but the Roosevelts did. And that took a little doing to find them. But both Franklin and Eleanor came here to dedicate 2 dams that had been washed out by the flood of 1927. So here he is, arriving in Waterbury in the open car he was famous for, with Eleanor at his side. If he talked too much, she kicked him right in that brace on his leg. And he stopped talking and they moved on. Always very shy, always very influential, probably the most influential First Lady for all that she did. When he came to Vermont, he dedicated the Waterbury Dam, and then he moved on and dedicated the Wrightsville Dam, and then he went to Montpelier. It didn't do him any good. It was also campaign time. He was coming with the photographers for the campaign of 1936 to dedicate those dams. In 1936, the only state in the Union that did not elect a Democratic governor was Vermont. George Aiken was elected instead. So here's the news of the landslide here in Vermont. Harry Truman, I'm working on him. He went everywhere in a small open car investigating fraud, graft, and overspending in defense plants at the beginning of World War II as a senator, a fact-finding, investigating senator. And as far as I can tell, he didn't miss anybody. So it's hard to find a record of him coming here. He did come here as president, as did Dwight Eisenhower, who stayed with his Secretary of Commerce, Sinclair Weeks, and liked to fish in the Dog River between Montpelier and Northfield. So Ike liked to come here. He came with Mamie. This is a wonderful portrait of her. Usually she did not travel with him, especially during World War II. John Kennedy came 3 times. First time he came was to a Holy Name Society convention of the Diocese of Vermont when he was a young senator in 1954. But he came back in 1960 twice, trying to be elected from Vermont. Vermont was getting to be less and less important politically. It had gone from 7 electoral votes when Teddy Roosevelt came down to 3. But those 3 votes were crucial in 1960 in that very close election with Richard Nixon. So here's Kennedy, huge crowds at the airport, a policeman there. There were only 100 police, no Secret Service, no troops, no nothing. And a policeman in Burlington told the Free Press afterward, "Boy, I'm glad we got him out of here safe and sound." The police were terrified. We all know what happened shortly after that. His successor after Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson, came, completely ignored security. But he met with people out at the hangar at Burlington International Airport. And one of the men up here on the roof is now a department head at Champlain College. He was a young Air Force policeman who dropped his automatic on the tarmac at the feet of Nixon while Nixon was speaking next to Air Force One. But they were slugging it out. And what's amazing when you consider what had just happened, Nixon's entire parade route was listed in the Burlington Free Press so that the crowds could turn out. The same with LBJ, so the crowds would turn out. So LBJ drew huge crowds in 1964, 20,000 people at Burlington Airport for LBJ. Johnson tells Vermonters Goldwater isn't their man. Goldwater doesn't come to dispute it, but he sends young Richard Nixon for his first campaign visit. So Nixon comes in '64 for the first of 3 visits to stump for Barry Goldwater, as does Congressman Gerald Ford. And Ford came back 3 times. Once to campaign for Ronald Reagan, who was pelted with snowballs during his presidential visit to Barrie. Rather large snowballs by a rather large, inhospitable crowd protesting the Vietnam War. The first visit from George Bush came when he, too, came to campaign. George Bush came in 1988 to campaign for his father. His father did not come at the time. George Bush told the Vermontians how happy he was to be here. He was working on it already. Didn't happen overnight. Dad came to try to prop up Peter Smith for re-election against Bernie Sanders. Dad came to the Williston Firehouse in the year 2000 to campaign to support Peter Smith against Bernie Sanders. There's an old history there. And the son came back that same in the year 2000 to give a fundraising speech at Sugar Bush. Who have we left out? Only one. That is got to be the schmaltziest presidential portrait I have ever seen. Wow, what was he running or casting? He came 3 times. The first time he came, he was an hour and a half behind schedule when he arrived in Burlington. It was pouring rain. I had my little daughter on my shoulders and my wife there. We were getting drenched. There were 6,000 people crowded down by Perkins Pier. And when he finally arrived and took to the podium, he said, "You've had 12 years of trickle-down economics. What's 10 minutes more?" Crowd cheered. He went on a wonderful stock speech, didn't lose any votes. Came back in 1995 to immortalize the Oasis Diner, where he met with the governor and soon-to-be DNC Chairman Howard Dean. They crowded into one booth. Leahy, Dean, Mayor Clavell, and Bill Clinton. The upholstery collapsed. It has not been replaced. And so the only shrine to presidents coming, except for the Vermont Hotel in Vermont history, is this plaque in a booth in the Oasis Diner in Burlington, Vermont. On this day, July 31st, 1995, President Bill Clinton, while visiting Burlington, ate lunch in this booth. The Secret Service was there for a week to make a turkey sandwich. I will end my talk at that point. No Republican has agreed to be seated in that booth in 12 years so far. Thank you very much. Well, it was a long one, and you've been very patient. We've had a lot of presidents. If you have any questions, I'll be very happy to try to answer them for you. Sir.
Did Coolidge go to Massachusetts for political reasons, that is, he had a chance to have a high-profile political career there rather than have one here? Over there.
Amherst. He went to Amherst and he never came back, basically. He opened a law office there. He ran for city council. He did very well. It's an interesting question whether he could have done as well here. I wonder. I think politics here were much more stratified by that time. There's a lot of interesting things about him we don't have time for. Take a close look at a portrait of him someday and look at the cheekbones. His mother was part Indian, and I happen to wonder if that was a liability here at the time. So he has the red hair of the Scottish side of his mother's background. But he went there and he did well. He opened a little office. He was very popular, and he just went after one office after another, right on up until he became police commissioner of Boston. In 1920, he became governor. He is the author of Trickle-Down Economics. His inaugural speech in 1920 was the basis for the economic policy of Ronald Reagan. And when Reagan became president, the president has the prerogative to take down portraits in the cabinet room and put up the portraits of presidents he wants. So behind Reagan's chair, he took down Harry Truman and put up Calvin Coolidge. So, and then did exactly what Coolidge did, cut taxes 4 times. Well, thank you again very much for your patience and your attention.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Very fascinating.
Very long, but I didn't want to leave anybody out.
The one couple had left a meatloaf in the oven.
Oh.
So they had to hurry
That's a
home.
pretty good, that's the best reason I've ever heard. Sorry they didn't take me with them. Yeah.
As usual, so many facts, you don't know where to start to follow them up.
Yeah. I tried to hew it to a theme anyway. So, good to see you, John.
Thank you. That was excellent.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me. It's good.
Sorry about the water. I didn't hear.
Good to see you again. It's a little too early in the year for the side porch, but maybe again.